If the American government continues to increase their deficits, then Canada and Mexico will both lose control of inflation. And I think it's already obvious that this is happening right now, and we're seeing this play out right before our eyes. You've been told a lie when it comes to money. You've been told that the central bank is at the center of the monetary universe and they are responsible for absolutely everything. But what if I told you that isn't true? Let's get right into it. So when it comes to money, it is brought into existence mainly via credit in the credit-based world that we live in today. And I think that is obvious to you and I, that most of the money that is in the economy is brought into existence by credit. So the interesting part about having a discussion when it comes to this is a lot of questions often come up. Most people believe, especially people in the mainstream media, the most of the herd, that the central bank is essentially at the center of that universe and they control inflation via interest rates, and they are the ones that when they do QE caused all the inflation that we saw in 2020 and 2023. Thing is, that's not the case at all. QE is just literally bank reserves. So all you've got to do is just imagine QE as your bank giving you a line of credit. The thing is, your bank can take away that line of credit at any time, especially if it goes by unused. So that's all bank reserves are when the government is doing QE. Now there's a secondary component to QE and the programs that the central bank does that can definitely be inflationary, and that is monetizing the government's deficit. So what on earth does that mean? Because that sounds like a mouthful, so let me break it down to you real simple. So essentially a government deficit is just a debt. It's essentially when the government is taking on debt. It's taking on more debt because essentially the tax receipts don't cover the amount of spending, so they're then running on deficits. And that's exactly what we've had. We've had these record deficits, and it's not just in Canada, it's in the UK, it's in the US. The US is actually one of the most influential governments when it comes to global inflation, and one that specifically Canadians should be watching in the future. So what does monetizing the debt mean then? So I've explained what government deficits are, so let's explain now what monetizing the debt means. Essentially what that means is the central bank is purchasing the government debt. So the government always is going to have a buyer for that debt, so they can just issue unlimited amounts of debt. Now the thing that most people don't think through when it comes to that, and this is obvious as well, it's all in history and the data, that when you look back at the data, for example in 2008 when the central banks expanded their balance sheets, did that cause massive amounts of inflation? No, it didn't. So when a central bank is monetizing government debt, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to be directly inflationary. It's what the government does with that money, it's what the government does with that credit that really makes all the difference on whether it's going to be inflationary or not. Now the reality is we know of course it's going to be inflationary in some way or another, but the inflation that we've seen in 2022 was largely because the government actually went out and gave direct transfer payments into people's bank accounts, not just people as well, into businesses' bank accounts. And this money was just spent wildly, and there was massive amounts of fraud, massive amounts of corruption. And the idea of the programs was to pump the system with massive amounts of liquidity to stop deflation. Believe it or not, what the central bank and the government were concerned about was actually deflation. And what they did was they created a huge amount of inflation as a result. And that was how they did all these different programs, and it takes time for that to feed through in the economy. I mean, all you've got to think about is you've got more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, so that's going to bid up the prices. And that's essentially what you saw when you had those direct transfer payments that went into people's bank accounts. It was an absolute disaster and train wreck. So now we understand how that all works, we can begin to understand the other things that are going on that I think are going to be very important going into the future. We know from many books and history in itself, if you just go and study it, that we are in the end cycle of the empire's demise, that empire being the American empire, being the G7, whatever you want to call it. And one thing that generally happens when an empire is on its downfall is essentially they'll start printing money. And that can be printing money via deficit spending or whatever it is. The fact is they're printing money into existence via credit. They did this in the Roman times by debasing the silver coins. It has been done for thousands of years. So this is not a new thing that has just happened. It is something that we can expect to continue to happen into the future. And it's something that we've seen already. The US government has now figured out that the way to buy votes, the way to appease people of lower classes is by sending them direct transfer payments to their bank accounts. And that's what they did in 2021. Now, those things affect two countries massively, Mexico and Canada, because the countries are so interconnected. And the American economy is also one of the biggest economies in the world, if not the biggest economy in the world, depending on who you speak to. And that means that they have massive influence over global money, but they especially have massive influence over the money in North America because we share so many different trade routes, we share so many ports, we share so many commodities. If the American government continues to increase their deficits, then Canada and Mexico will both lose control of inflation. And I think it's already obvious that this is happening right now, and we're seeing this play out right before our eyes, and we'll continue to see it. Will inflation fall into the future? Yeah, that is probable considering the trend right now. But will there be a resurgence in inflation? Again, that is probable considering prior history and what we're seeing play out. And when you have empires that are falling, essentially what happens is the political classes get torn apart. Each side becomes more divisive. There's more political separation between the parties. They're attacking each other instead of working for a greater good of the actual country, working to actually fix things and get things done. They're more focused on attacking the other side and more focused on even trying to put the other side in jail. And this will only get worse. What's happening with Trump, whether you like him or you hate him, is dangerous for American politics. And people who've studied history can only see the parallels between what's going on in America right now and the past. Even Roman Empire, Egyptian Empire, British Empire, they're all out there, and it's a fascinating subject to go and study. The US government also has the ability to print money and not have massive severe consequences as other countries because they have the reserve currency. There's always these crises that we keep seeing happening that essentially mean that the US government needs to print money because the global money supply is demanding more money. So it's actually needed. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because as they continue to print even larger and larger amounts of money, because it's constantly larger amounts that we need in this credit-based system, there becomes a point where they get to such an amount that it starts to really impact inflation. It starts to really move that needle on inflation. And that's exactly what we saw in 2022 and in 2021 and here in 2023 too. And the compounded effect of all this inflation is still yet to be realized by the masses, because the masses, their response to the massive amount of inflation that we've seen has been to take on more credit, to subsidize their incomes with more credit. And this has been taught over just the past 20, 30 years. You can actually pinpoint it to the 1987 stock market crash that was when this started. And essentially we've seen this play out. We've seen this movie before because it ended in the 1930s, but you had essentially, you could get credit for anything and you could buy anything. Buy now, pay later was in the roaring 20s. It was a big feature of the roaring 20s and the economy seemed so hot. And what happened in the end? The central banks, they came in and they tried to rein in that economy, but they couldn't. And it created a massive depression that we saw, and people don't even acknowledge it. A depression kind of makes it seem more rosy than it actually was. It was a major crisis event that lasted over a decade and only really stopped when World War II started, which you have to think about, you know, all the politics surrounding World War II at the time, because there's always these distractions you notice and realize throughout history that distract the masses away from the hardship that is essentially going on. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please leave me a comment. I love to speak to you in the comments. You may enjoy this video and you may enjoy this video here. Also check out our affiliate, which is ExpressVPN. You can get their best deal by going to expressvpn.com/marketmania. I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.